Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Butcher, editor-at-large, TechCrunch. And obviously, many of you have been listening to the startup battlefield yesterday and today. But it's always interesting, isn't it, to find out what happened to those companies, after they've gone to the battlefield. And one of the legendary companies that went from battlefield in TechCrunch Disrupt in 2010 all the way to an IPO not long ago was Cloudflare. And today, it's obviously a public company. So we're super excited to hear about that journey all the way from battlefield to IPO with Matthew Prince and Michelle Zatlyn, the co-founders, who I shared pizza with not long after their launch in Davos, in the World Economic Forum. And nobody knew who they were. And now here they are, incredibly successful. And moderating this panel with them is our very own enterprise guru, Ron Miller. Give them a big welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Welcome, and welcome to Matthew and Michelle. I want to start off with a show of hands, and I'm wondering how many startup founders, if any, are in the audience this morning. Yeah, there's a few of you. You're in the right place, because this company went from zero to a $21 billion public company in just around 13 years. They raised over $330 million along the way. And by the way, they debuted at this very event in 2010 at the TechCrunch Disrupt Battlefield. And I will point out that Matthew actually came in the T-shirt from that event today. So that's pretty cool.
Which was very hard to find deep in my closet. You can tell how old we are because there were floppy disks on the T-shirt back then.
Yeah, that's old. I'll also point out that they didn't win, but that didn't matter because they won in the end. They became a very successful company, and there's a lot you can learn from them. So let's get started. So, when I think about Cloudflare, and you kind of alluded to that when we were coming on, people have a hard time nailing down what you guys do, right? Because you do a lot of things. Your internet security, your content delivery network, your infrastructure as a service, your platform as a service, and I'm probably missing a few things. Matthew, how would you describe the company in a succinct way, especially for folks who might not know who you are?
Yeah, I remember it's interesting. Before I came out today, I actually went back and watched our pitch from 2010, and was sort of horrified at how young I looked compared to today. But what I remember, one of the questions from one of the judges was, "What's your goal? What are you trying to do at Cloudflare?" And I said, "Our goal is to rebuild a better version of the internet." And I think that's exactly what we've done today. So today we run one of the world's largest networks. And on top of that network, we've built a bunch of functionality that makes the internet perform, frankly, the way it should have if we'd known what the internet was going to be from the beginning. So yes, it has security for sort of the front door of your business, your website, your API, whatever applications you're putting online. But it turns out you also want security and performance for the back door of your business, making sure that your employees have a great experience, making sure that they're secure, making sure that they don't get hacked. And you want that network to be incredibly reliable, to be something that is as fast as possible, to be efficient, because it's actually embarrassing that, yes, there are 4 billion people that have access to the internet today, but there are 4 billion who don't, largely because it's too expensive and too complicated. And frankly, you want it to be more private, because the original sin of the internet is that privacy wasn't built in from the beginning. And so when we think about what we're doing, we think that we're trying to live up to our mission, and our mission is to help build a better internet, and that's what we come to work to do every day.
So, Michelle, I interviewed you in 2020, which was when we were in lockdown. So it was a virtual interview. We were on Zoom. But we talked about building a bold idea. And obviously what you just described is a pretty bold idea. Yesterday there was a panel here on building capital-intensive startups. And part of what that entailed was having a worldwide network of data centers to run this kind of a business. And that's pretty capital intensive. when you guys were pitching to investors, and for people out here who might have a similarly bold idea, how did you pitch to investors, and what reaction did you get?
Yeah, there's so many different ways to build a company. So let me just start by that, and like lots of different ways to build a company. But one thing, you use the word bold. I think we've never been short on being really bold and big ideas. I mean, to help build a better version of the internet, that's a big idea. There's a lot of people who walk the other way. They're just like, whoa, these people are on a different wavelength. But what's interesting when you have a big idea and you're a good storyteller, which I would say my business partner is a very good storyteller, is there's some folks who say, hey, tell me more about that. And they lean in because they're like, that's interesting, because everything else is not so bold. You're comparing, there's a lot of things that are kind of easy to get your hands around, makes it all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed. And that's what most, whether it's investors or reporters or just general public hear, things that are really easy to get your hands around. They're kind of neat boxes. But when you have something bold, you stand out. And so I think that early on, we had a big vision, we had a big story, we had a big idea. And while not everyone came along, it was the right people that came along. And it was interesting. I remember we were telling folks what we were doing. A lot of people were like, I don't get it. That's going to take a lot of money, take a long time.
Right.
But there were other folks who said, this is super interesting, and I want to be involved in it. And that was both engineers who wanted to come work on something that was interesting, that was going to change the world. They're like, I love the internet. I want to be a part of this. And that's how they came to work at our company instead of other companies. Or investors who said, I want to be an investor. Because if you do what you're going to say you're going to do, you're going to build something iconic. And I want to be part of something that's iconic. And so I think that you don't have to get everyone to see the vision, but you do need to get some portion of investors and people to see the vision. And then if you start to get traction, then some of the folks before, they were like, not for me. They start to say, hey, actually, I want to learn more. Maybe I wrote you off too soon. Let's talk again. And over time, you turn a lot of these folks into believers or champions, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm wondering how many times you heard no before you heard that first person who saw your vision.
Well, no one says no. Exactly. They say it in a really polite way. There's a lot of politeness that goes on because humans are bad at saying no. You kind of want to be liked. It's a connected world. One of my biggest lessons doing this for 13 years, very connected world. Even when someone is not so nice to you, I'd say kind of take the high road because you might need them at some point, because it's just a very connected world at the end. And so what happens is you get ghosted a lot, or they slow things down, and people just kind of don't say no, so they just slow roll you. And as a startup founder, many of you raised your hands, I mean, speed, urgency is one of your greatest secret weapon. You have to be able to do more things than a big company in a shorter period of time, because you got to make progress. You got more things to do. And so I think it was maybe less no, it's more of the politeness of, hey, not right now, or they slow to set up the next meeting. And I think what carried us through those periods of, okay, they weren't as bought in as us, because again, not everyone was as bought in early on, where we were super aligned, and we had a team that was super aligned, and we had initial users that were super aligned, like our customers. And I really remember these old sayings of 10 highs in a day, 10 lows in a day being a startup founder. That was what my experience was, like great things followed by not so great things. But one of the things that really carried us through were customers using the service, writing us emails saying, oh my God, I signed up for Cloudflare, and for the first time in 5 years, I got to sleep through the night because my pager didn't go off. Because what was happening before is their apps or websites were falling over from just attackers, and we stopped that, and we just made it go away. And I think that it was that sort of feedback that carried us through all those periods.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much being on this stage, not this stage, but the TechCrunch stage in 2010, how much did that help in terms of opening doors for you, for investors, like maybe taking you a little more seriously?
I think it was, our plan was always to launch at the TechCrunch event. And it was actually the TechCrunch 50, and I remember Mike Arrington announced as we were starting to ramp up, because it was our plan, that they were canceling TechCrunch 50. And we were scrambling to figure out what we were going to do. And then then Disrupt launched in New York. And then we were like, well, we're not ready to do the New York event because that was in the spring. And is there going to be a fall event? And everyone was being super cagey, and we didn't know. I mean, today we we would just call Mike or we'd call Connie and say, hey, what are you guys doing? And we'd know, but no one would return. We were no ones.
Right.
And so when it finally happened, we went and applied, and we're fortunate enough to get in. And we really thought that the spirit was you had to launch a product and open it to the public that day there on stage. So we really used that time as a deadline for our team to motivate them to get done. And we had eight people, most of them engineers. And when Michelle and I walked backstage, there were still 40 unresolved bugs that if they didn't get resolved by the time we flipped the switch, it wasn't gonna work. And so we're watching our phones and it's like, okay, I got number 17, I got number 4, and they're just ticking them down. And as we walked on stage, there were still about 3 that we weren't sure like signups were gonna work. And it was crazy. We started that day with probably about 100 customers. We ended that day with thousands. By the end of the first day, we had customers in 10 countries around the world. By the end of the first month, we had customers in literally every country on earth. And it's just really been just a rocket ship ever since. And so I think we owe a ton to TechCrunch. And what's also interesting is a year later when we came back, the TechCrunch folks you guys were like, hey, you should have something to announce. And I remember we were like, we've got to figure out something to announce. And so we used that as a deadline to come out with a new product that we announced at that stage. And it took something that would have otherwise been kind of a boring announcement, and it gave it some life, both internally, but then also externally. And one of the things that I think has been a real hallmark of Cloudflare, if you've been following us, is we have these things called Innovation Weeks. And the Innovation Weeks are a little bit like how we strip down a user conference to its bare essentials of how do we create a deadline for a product team. And really that was born out of that first anniversary coming back to TechCrunch. And so September 27th is our birthday, which is next week. And we've got an Innovation Week, our birthday week, which is when we think about what we do in terms of giving back to the internet. And it's we were spending a lot of this morning and a lot of yesterday reviewing all of the announcements, and it's pretty amazing. And again, I think it comes back to that idea of having a deadline, having a stage, having an event, and then using that.
Right. I was hoping you could do some of those announcements here, but as it turned out, that didn't work out in timing-wise.
Should have put us on the stage next door, maybe, just as a little hint.
So it's not always a smooth ride when it comes to being a startup, right? And in May, you guys announced that you were laying off some people, including 100 salespeople. And you kind of ruffled some feathers, publicly stating that these were underperformers. And I'm quoting you, and you said, when fish are jumping right into the boat, you don't need to be a very good fisherman, which the implication being like when you have to really sell, if you're not really a good salesperson, it's going to show. You're going to be exposed, right? But you were criticized pretty hard on social media for that, for lacking empathy. And when you were asked about it by reporters like me, you didn't back down from it. You sort of said, that's who we are. And so I'm wondering, do you have any regrets about that at this point?
I think that not really, honestly. I think if you look across the entire industry, things changed during COVID. I remember early in Cloudflare's history, somebody said, Cloudflare's like a family. And Michelle said, no, we're not a family. Because the problem with families is families are incredibly rigid in their hierarchy. No matter how obnoxious your drunk Uncle Hank is, you still got to invite him to Christmas dinner.
Right.
No matter how hard you work and how successful you are, your parents are always going to be above you, and their parents are going to be above them, and it has this. And so that makes for great comedy and drama. That fact that humans change, but the structure of families don't. But it doesn't make for a great team. What you want a great team to be is like a great high-performance team. And, Chris Paul might be a terrific basketball player, but he wasn't the right guy for the Suns. And so you trade those people around. And in the early days of Cloudflare, up through when we went public in 2019, up through the beginning of the pandemic, we were very much a high-performance culture. I think we were a very empathetic culture, but we weren't the right place for everyone to work. And you had to work hard to come to Cloudflare because we had really hard problems to solve, and we had a real challenge of taking this complicated product and figuring out how to sell it. And what changed was, I remember the phone calls early in the pandemic where people would say, I don't know, I'm living at home now, I'm a single mom or a single dad, I've got a kid who's now not going to school, I've got to figure out how to hold my own mental health together. I have to figure out how to hold my family together, education for my kids together. And what do I do in terms of, also doing my job? And we said what I think was the human and right thing to say, which is those first things about yourself come first. And then when you have time, come do stuff at work. And I think that's exactly the right thing that we should do, because we were going through this massive crisis as a species. And it was super hard. But while it was clear that on March 13th of 2020, that was the day you should switch from kind of high performance team mode into family mode, what wasn't clear is when you switch back.
Right.
And so when we look across a bunch of industries and other companies that are out there, I think a lot of people are saying, gosh, productivity has slipped. It doesn't feel like we've got the same urgency. What do we do? Let's get everyone to come back to the office. I think that's a terrible answer. Like, we've actually learned how to be, a much more flexible workplace, a place where people can work, where they want and when they want. And that's great, where productivity has actually been high. But I think we've got to be, and we're stealing, Michelle and I were talking about this earlier, but we're stealing a little bit from the team at Atlassian, Mike and Scotty at Atlassian. We've got to be much more prescriptive about how people work. And that means holding people more accountable. And the same way that if you can't shoot at the Warriors, probably shouldn't be on the starting team.
Right.
If we can't have people who sell, they shouldn't be our lead salespeople. They might be great salespeople somewhere else, but they're not the right people for us.
So when I talk to big companies, and I talk to analysts, they say that big companies, and you guys are more medium than, you're not a Microsoft or a Salesforce or something like that, but they will often use a recession as an excuse to get rid of underperformers. But you said the quiet part out loud. They don't usually say that. If you could do it again, would you do it differently in terms of the way that you reacted to questions about it?
Not at all. Our internal team was like, thank God, it's about time.
All right. That's clear. But you, as the Chief Operations Officer,
Okay.
What, pardon me?
Yes?
You have to kind of deal with the fallout in terms of team morale, or, you have to hire people, and, when the CIO frankly sounds cold about how he's laying off people, how did it affect your ability to recruit quality people? And did people still want to work for Cloudflare? Because there were comments on social media that said, like, whoa, this is like really, like I said, saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, so the answer is yes, people still want to work at Cloudflare. We have hired lots of amazing people to join Cloudflare, and folks are doing great and objectively better, which is wonderful. And I think your point is actually an interesting one for all the founders in the room. When you build your company, you just can't make everyone happy. And if you try to make everyone happy, that's like the fastest way to mediocrity. And you're going to have to pick sides, you're going to have to take stances. We call it being principled. It's one of our values, is we're very principled in lots of different things, whether it's internet policy, like public policy, or around how we run our business. Again, I think being a founder-led business, you can be more principled and take stances. Actually, it becomes a superpower. It's like a huge founder advantage. You should really use it to your advantage. But it's not for everyone. And it's not a popularity contest. It's not about trying to make everyone happy and be like, oh, they're these revered people who are doing everything perfect. It's not that. It's what's best for your business and executing on the path you're on, the journey you're on, and driving the best outcomes for your customers, your team, our employees, and our shareholder base. And we really are very hyper-focused on those three things. And I think that served us well.
So,
and just
I'm sorry, go ahead.
A really fine point on it. Applications are up since then, not down. We'll have over 1 million people apply to work at Cloudflare this year, which is up 3x over last year.
Okay, fair enough. You have practically the internet running through your servers, right? And that comes with a huge responsibility. And there are always going to be controversies associated with that. over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen some pretty crazy things come through the internet, and you've been pressured as a company to cut off certain groups. You've kind of struggled with when to do that and how to do that. And at one point, Matthew, you likened it to the phone company not cutting the line for people saying awful things, which is, an okay metaphor. But given the state of the world and some of the, the very dangerous and illegal things that were going on, sometimes not illegal, but certainly immoral, you seem to struggle with when to cut people off and how to cut people off. What is your bar for saying, this is too much? Like, we cannot have these people using our services to behave this way.
It's funny, Ronnie, you're very concerned about things which end up being actually small concerns internally. So it seems like, and again, it's an interesting press story, but that this would be something that we think about every single day. But it turns out, for the most part for us, it's a pretty easy standard, which is if something is illegal somewhere in the world, then it can't be on our network in that place in the world. And it's pretty simple. We follow the law wherever we operate around the world. There's an extremely small set of circumstances where there are things where it's not technically illegal, but it's also something that we're just very deeply uncomfortable with and we think is actually outright dangerous. And if I think back over the entire last 12 plus years of Cloudflare, I can think of 3 examples of that. So the mean time for us having one of these challenges is once every basically 4 years. And when that happens, I think we take actions, and we should struggle with it. One thing we could do is just pretend it wasn't hard and point to paragraph 13G in our terms of service and say, this disappeared and no comment. I don't think that's the right thing, because as Michelle said, we want to be a principled organization, but we also want to be a transparent organization. And we want to talk about the places where maybe the laws of the land haven't caught up with some of the challenges that we're seeing online. And that's why we have a significant public policy team. That's why I spend a lot of time in DC and Brussels and around the world meeting with policymakers, trying to say, I don't think we're the right people to pick what is good and bad online, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people who should be picking what's good and bad online, but those people are elected or endowed with some sort of sense of true sort of rule of law cognizance. And if you don't have that, again, I think it's something that's dangerous. But on a daily basis, this isn't actually something we struggle that much with, which isn't to say that if you're further up the stack, someone like a Facebook or a Twitter or a YouTube, or I guess X now, or YouTube, they have to think about this much more, whereas being a little bit lower down, it becomes something where once out of every 4 years, it's gonna bubble up, and there will be something that bubbles up undoubtedly, probably, we would expect actually probably sometime in the next 2 years.
Because of the election, you think?
I don't know if because of the election. Actually, I don't think because of the election. The election tends to be actually fairly straightforward in terms of what's there, and that's a very U.S.-centric view. We operate a network that's all around the world.
Sure.
So there's an election in some country that we're in every single day, and I think that the global nature, again, by the end of the first month after we launched, we had customers in every single country on earth. So we had to be an expert, not just in California politics or US politics, but to understand the entire global perspective. And so, no, it's really hard to predict what the next thing will be, but I'm glad that we have a really smart team who thinks about these issues.
So I'm a little surprised that you say you don't think about it, because it seems to me like there are pressure groups that must, every other week say, this site has to come down. They're saying outrageous things, but that doesn't happen?
Honestly, it bubbles up about once every 4 years.
Do you have a public policy team similar to what the artists formerly known as Twitter and Meta have in order to kind of field those kinds of concerns?
We have a very significant public policy team, and we work with regulators around the world, but their job is not so much to field those concerns. Their job is to think about what's the right policy for the internet going forward. So for instance, right now, actually, if you go back to December of 2021, we saw indications across our network that made us think it was very likely that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. And we then briefed, through our public policy team, US government officials saying, we think this is the case. And they said, yeah, we're seeing something similar. Let's go to the EU and tell them the same. The EU, we felt a little bit like we were Chicken Little, saying that sky is falling. And they're like, they're not going to invade. It's not a big deal. And frankly, from December through February 24th, it felt a little bit like maybe we were wrong. But behind the scenes, our public policy team worked with the Ukrainian government to identify what are the different critical pieces of infrastructure and how can we provide our services at no cost into that country. And that's the sort of work that I'm incredibly proud of, because we made sure that President Zelensky could get his message out about what was going on, that the world could see the horrors on the front lines of the battle that is happening right now in Ukraine. And had we not done that, I think it would be much less likely that Ukraine would have been able to share that with the rest of the world, and it would have been much less likely that they would have dealt with that. The other thing the public policy team does is then we do that, Russia turns around and personally sanctions me, which was sort of a weird badge of honor.
Right.
And then they sort of say, okay, now don't fly over Russia. So.
Well, and just zooming out for a lot of the founders in the room, it's interesting. When we started Cloudflare, I don't think we thought that we were going to need to be leading experts in this area. But this is what happens. This is what again, back to if you're building a bold company, you find yourself in places where you're like, okay, who do I call to get help on this topic? And the list is pretty short, so you got to build the capabilities internally, and that's called leadership. You got to stand up and make a call
Right.
and take a stance. We, again, are 13 years old, so I know a lot of the founders of our era, and not everyone invested in taking a stance or stepping up, but eventually you have to if you're successful. You eventually have to invest in this, because what's interesting, and I think I love that you're talking about this, Ron, because 6 years ago nobody was talking about this, but actually I think it's really important for AI that's about to come. Like, this is super important. The internet's 30 years old, so all of these laws that were made didn't take into account the internet and digital and meanness online and some of these things that happen online. And so countries are saying, okay, wait, what rules do we need to create? And it's not so black and white. There's some easy things, but most things are kind of nuanced. It's hard. And so it takes multiple stakeholders to come together, including the founders who are building the most innovative things. For sure, the big companies have to be at the table, the academics, the policymakers all have to lean in. And so what I like to say is the tech companies and the tech founders who lean in get to shape the future with the policymakers who are leaning in. They are defining the future and the new set of laws for the next 20 years. And I think it's pretty cool for the folks that are coming to the table. And thank God we've gone through this with the cloud the last 10 years. It makes me much more optimistic about being able to navigate the risks associated with AI. Because we have a framework, we have some conversations already started. They can they're different, but there are a lot of overlap. And so I think we're better prepared today than we were 8 years ago. 8 years ago, this was definitely not a topic that you would have on stage here.
Well, and if you look at the mistakes of this, if anyone's from or traveled through Europe, the fact that we've got, cookie banners that have just trained everyone to say accept,
Right.
which is one of the worst things we could possibly do for security, which hasn't actually dramatically improved anyone's privacy, has increased an enormous amount of cost, and has made the user experience worse. That's as we think about regulation, what happens when the people in this room don't engage with policymakers as policies are being written. And that's what we need to do, and that's very much why we lean forward in these policy issues, and it's why I think that hopefully the folks on the stage next door are doing the same.
So, I can't believe how fast this clock has run down. I have so much more I wanted to ask you, but we only have 2 minutes left. So I want to ask you a question about being founders and about still being with your company long after it IPO'd. And that happens, but it's rare. Usually you sail off into the sunset, you get a boat, you become an investor, you do something that is kind of outside the startup grind and the company day-to-day grind, but you didn't do it. What keeps you going, and when do you start? And within mind,
Yes,
only have a minute and a half.
I'll be brief. I'll make mine brief. I think being a founder, there's a huge advantage, and it's a huge privilege and responsibility. And then when you do something, I think not all opportunities are created equally. Again, that doesn't make one better than the other, but opportunities are different sizes. There's lots of ways to build a business, lots of ways to be successful, to build a successful life. But Cloudflare is a very big, shiny opportunity. And I bet you many of you in this room have a really big, shiny opportunity. And for me at Cloudflare, it's like, I want us to be set up to reach the full potential of that opportunity. And I think right now, it's better likely to happen with me there than not. And that's what keeps me going every single day. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that Matthew and I still get along. We work well together. There's lots of stories that you read about in TechCrunch that's not the case. And I think we've been pretty low drama internally. And I think it's because we're just so focused on reaching the full potential of our opportunity. And that's what keeps me going every day. And to help build a better internet, I mean, that's a huge mission.
So we got to wrap, so I'm afraid we won't hear from you, but we'll save that for another day. I just want to close by saying that it's obviously not always easy to build a startup, but this company is an example for every startup founder out there that it's possible to achieve your goals and become a successful public company. And I want to thank Matthew and Michelle for joining me, and I hope you'll give them a hand. Thanks.